in the late woodland period that we're talking about here, in this part of Virginia, most good pottery's going to be tempered with shell. And it's neat, you can actually look at the temper in a pottery shard if you find one in the archaeology. And by looking at the construction and the temper type of the pottery that you have, you can kind of date it that way. Because the shell tempered pottery is pretty much the highest form of pottery. It's the most recent development. Because the clay temper works so well, you can make very, very thin walled pots, which work really nicely. Before that, you'll see more like quartz or gravel tempered pottery, which also works fine. You just have to use a thicker wall. But with a good shell temper, nice thin walls, really fine pottery.
What does it mean to temper exactly?
Just add a grit to it.
Oh, okay.
And there's some chemistry that happens with shell, but I think the main purpose of adding the grit to the clay is the clay isn't actually a material, it's a particle size classification, and clay is the smallest. So teeny tiny, basically this is teeny tiny rocks mixed with water.
Right.
But they're so small that there's not really any room for them to expand and contract as you heat the pottery up. So I think by adding the grit, you're kind of spacing out the particles just a little bit so that they won't crack. If you add too much temper though, it's going to be super gritty and it's just going to kind of crumble. If you don't add any, it's going to break when you fire it. So it's a very, it's a science. It's a pretty precise science. And some clays will respond differently to different tempers than others. So you have to know your clay source and you have to know what you're doing with the tempering. That's why I really like just going to Clay Works in Richmond, Virginia and buying my clay pre-tempered. But learning how to temper your own clay and make something useful out of it's pretty cool too.
And what are your tools?
Well, besides my fingers here, my hands, I've got a pottery paddle, and you can see here I just added a coil, a ring of clay to the rim of this pot to make it a little bit bigger. And to kind of blend that coil in and make sure the wall of the pot's still a consistent thickness, I'll use this guy here to blend. And shape the pot that way. Shape with my hands, and then once I'm happy with the shape of the base, I'll score the rim of the pot again. That's just adding a bit of texture.
Is that just decorative, or is it?
No, this is going to give basically traction, so that when I add another layer, it's got something to kind of bite into.
Oh, okay. So you're going to keep making coils and kind of
coil and coil and coil. And I'd like to make this pot maybe that big.
Okay.
Enough for a stew for two, maybe.
Yeah. And you could like boil water in it and everything.
Once
right?
it's dried and then fired, it's ceramic basically. So we'll use it for boiling water, cooking soups and stews, things like that. You can use smaller ones for smaller projects, like maybe melting down resin for glues, melting down hoof matter and epidermis from animal skins to make glues that way, things like that. But it's good to always have a container you can boil water in. And this would be a craft, probably a summer craft. It's a lot easier to dig raw clay in the summertime that the women will be doing. The women are going to be preparing the food in the villages, so they're probably going to be the ones to learn and perfect the art of pottery as well.
And do you put the pot in the fire, or do you put rocks in the pot?
That's what I usually do. You can kind of prop the pot up on some rocks and then build a small little brush fire underneath it. I know some people will take the pot and they'll just nestle it into a coal bed after they've let a small fire kind of die down a bit. There's a lot of ways you can use it. You just don't really want to shock it with heat. You don't want to like put it right into a blazing fire, even if it has already been fired. That could still cause your clay to break. But the trick is just to heat it up gradually whenever you use it.
How long does it take to fire it in I assume an open fire pit?
Yeah, that's what we'll use. It depends on the size of the pot, but because you want to do it so gradually, it does take a while. It's an all-day process. Maybe 12 to 13 hours for a pot like this. So it's a good idea to have a lot of pottery ready.
Yeah.
Just because you don't want to be.
How do you do it? So you make how do you do it gradually if you make the? For interrupting. If you make the so you make the bed of coals.
You make your bed of coals. You'll build a fire, let it die down a bit. What I usually do is I won't even.
Hi. Come on back. I think I've sort of got myself at a dead end here. It's sort of demonstrating how it can be getting ready to work on it. How it can be inspired. I've been doing these work a lot. I've got other styles of these work.
Me a finer finish, basically. And then that other tool that I just set down, up here, if you want to feel that, does it feel those bigger ridges? But then down here, they're a little bit smoother, right? The ridges are smaller. So this tool is going to bring those bigger ridges down to try and make it as smooth as I can really get it.
Okay.
So now you might want to take just a couple steps back to get out of the pedal here. But just look for really fine, small shavings to come off on this side of the bowl here.
Stuff coming off.
So we're taking away those bigger ridges, getting a little bit smoother there. One of the first things I have to do after I make this into a roughly round shape with a hatchet is I take a big hammer and I drive that down into the center of what's called my blank. And then I have somewhere that I can wrap my rope around, right? Because that string, that rope is what's driving, and the pole that it's attached to.
Oh, okay.
What's driving your piece of wood, but if I tried to wrap it over here, it's just going to come off one side or the other. So this here is called your mandrel. And your mandrel arm is what you wrap the rope around. What do you think this rope would have been made of 400 years ago? Can you guess? Something kind of funny. It's called cat gut. Isn't that funny? But I'll tell you what, it's actually not the guts of a cat. It's usually the guts of a sheep. This is like intestines that they cut into very fine ribbons and treat it and stretch it and twist it in such a way that it becomes basically you can make it in any size, from small, fine string to thicker. But today they still use it for instruments, and some old clocks they'll use it for those. But it's pretty expensive stuff, so I use this fake nylon cord. But it really has about the same qualities. Very resistant to abrasion, and but still grips the wood very well. Actually, I'm going to probably re-wrap, pull this to the other side here. If I can. Right.
Watching?
Now I'm going to go back to this rougher tool. You can see the difference in the shapes.
Oh yeah.
See, this has much more of kind of a bell curve. This has a really steep, sharp, kind of pointed curve to it. But one, of course, this one here, will take a bigger shaving with that bigger curve. So that's kind of your roughing tool. This is more of a finishing tool. And then this one, you can see it's got that curve to it that really helps me get down into the bottom of the bowl.
Oh, okay.
When I get near the end. But turners 400 years ago, specifically the bodgers, who were the guys that turned the bowls, would have had, in many cases, dozens of different tools for the specific shapes that they were turning. And this right here, this piece of wood that comes out, this is my tool rest. Very, very simple. And I just adjust it. There's a series of holes and a couple nails and a wedge. And I can adjust it in and out based on how close I need my tool to the piece of wood. I just probably about like there is good for starting. So I'll pop one nail in that hole, one in front of it, and then work that wedge in there. And that's what's gonna, I'm gonna double check. I always want to make sure you're nice and tight on the points when you flip it over the other side. And I'll put a little more oil on there. This is just walnut oil.
Oh, okay.
And that helps to keep the points from heating up too much and actually burning into the wood. You know what? I might have to move that string a little bit.
Called pellagra. So pellagra was a problem for these people that had adopted this corn diet, but didn't bring with them the tradition and the technology of making hominy out of it. And in the southeastern U.S., you know, in sort of later times, that was also a problem. A lot of people were getting pellagra. But that's the cool thing about hominy. And hominy is actually a Powhatan word. And then there's another thing you can make that's sort of a traditional Powhatan food. This is, in Powhatan, it's called uskata hamen. It's another type of corn. Today we call it grits. So some people call it hominy grits, grits. So it's actually originally a Native American food. Here the Powhatan word for it is uskata hamen. And it's just basically when you're grinding the corn, if you want a nice fine cornmeal flour like you see there, you've got to grind it, but then you have to sift out all the chunks, and then grind the chunks, and then sift out the chunks. But you know, sometimes they would use the chunks to make a type of porridge called uskata hamen, which is what we call grits today. But yeah, in this time of the year, there'd be lots of fish and seafood would be a big part of the diet too. So catching lots of fish. All the food comes from the people in your family. So the men are fishing, the women are farming, and gathering the wild plants. So around this time of the year, some of the early corn is going to start coming ripe. So you might be eating some fresh corn. If the corn hasn't come ripe yet, you're probably going to be eating other wild things. You've got lots of tubers like tuckahoe. You can make bread out of tuckahoe. In the early spring, you gather these tuckahoe tubers, you cut them really thin, and you dry them in the sun, and then you pound them up into a flour to make bread that way. So tuckahoe bread until the corn comes in, then you're making corn bread, which the Powhatan word for corn bread is apone, which in some places in the south they still call cornbread corn pone, and that comes from Algonquin. Lots of loan words from the Algonquin language in English. So pone is a less common one, but things that are really common like tomahawk, hickory, hominy, persimmon, moccasin, raccoon, possum, skunk, all Powhatan words. Well, some of them are other dialects of Algonquin, but a lot of them are specifically Powhatan words, like from right here. Because remember, this is the first permanent English-speaking colony, so this is where English-speaking people are going to get a lot of their new language from to describe some of the new things they see here, at least things that are new to them. Because you know, the colonists, when they arrive, they call it Virginia, partially because they see it as a virgin land, a new world, a vast wilderness. But to the people that have been living here for hundreds of years, it wasn't all that new. They actually called it Senecomica, which there's been a few theories as to what that means. But the one I buy is it means densely inhabited land, or land with many towns, or something along those lines. Because the Comica or Comico ending you see in a lot of place names, like towns, and specific like Werowacomico is a good example. Wera probably means antlers, and